This is part 2 of a 2-part training designed to help PTAs host hybrid events and meetings. National PTA strongly suggest you view both parts and that you start with part 1. Ideas shared in part 1 are referenced in this part 2. National PTA also strongly recommends that you download the handout, which contains a deep dive into both technology and facilitation. There you will find lots of resources, examples, and suggestions. So now let's start with a quick review of what you learned in part 1, and some of these slides should look familiar. Hybrid has always been needed. It opens PTA to anyone, anywhere. Hybrid is about equity and inclusion. Hybrid is more than just streaming an event. In a true hybrid setting, everyone attending has the same basic experience, together as one group at your PTA's hybrid event or meeting. Everyone sees everyone else, hears everyone else, and participates like everyone else. Successful hybrid events and meetings include 2 major components: the technical aspect, which was addressed in part 1 of this training, and the facilitation side that will be addressed in this training. Neither is more important. For our recorded trainings, we define an event as a gathering, like a town hall or presentation, while a meeting involves debating, motions, and minutes. It is an important distinction. If you do not know the difference, both part 1 of this training and the handout explain the difference. And please remember to check with your state PTA to be sure hybrid meetings are okay in your state. This video contains 2 scenarios for you to evaluate featuring Pine Ridge PTA, which will hold a hybrid PTA event followed by a hybrid business meeting. As in part 1, we suggest you take notes during the scenarios. Now is a good time to pause the recording and gather your note-taking tools. Pine Ridge PTA is a birth to 5 community-based PTA committed to hybrid. They identified experienced volunteers to help, purchased equipment, and identified venues for their events. They know planning is the key to successful hybrid facilitation, and as you will hear, a lot of planning went into the event and special board meeting. Their venue is not perfect, and they know it. So they paid special attention to overcoming technical obstacles when they prepared for their town hall event. Your PTA may need to overcome obstacles too, so pay attention to how Pine Ridge PTA adapted. Think about what your PTA would have done in similar circumstances. And once again, put yourself in Joe's and Kyle's shoes and compare their experiences. Ready? Tonight, Pine Ridge PTA hosts an education budget town hall event open to the entire community. The town's finance director and the school superintendent joined the Pine Ridge PTA president to speak about how the education budget is assembled and when and how taxpayers can have an impact on the budget's creation. This event has been heavily promoted, so Pine Ridge PTA expects a large crowd. They decided to use a small auditorium at Town Hall as their venue. The auditorium is not ideal. Pine Ridge PTA will tap into a video and audio stream from the auditorium systems, and they have their own cameras aimed at the audience. Virtual attendees will see and hear the presenters and the in-person audience. However, the people in the auditorium will not see or hear the virtual attendees. This was a big challenge for Pine Ridge PTA. They strive to be inclusive. They decided to use a virtual facilitator as a physical representative in the auditorium, and for that virtual facilitator to act as the virtual audience's surrogate and ask questions during the question and answer period. As you listen, decide if their plan worked. Kyle arrives at the event and is greeted by the PTA's vice president. Kyle finds a seat down front and waves at the camera aimed at the in-person audience. Kyle cannot see the virtual audience, but that's not a surprise since it was mentioned in the ground rules Kyle downloaded from the PTA's Google Drive more than a week ago. Kyle spots Max sitting near the front with his laptop and headphones. Kyle knows Max is tonight's virtual facilitator because that's also in the ground rules, just like the fact that Anna, sitting next to Max, is tech support for the evening. Max knows Joe, who will attend virtually, is happy about Max and Anna and grateful for the troubleshooting guide Pine Ridge PTA posted on the Google Drive earlier this week. Joe is out of town on business, so virtual attendance is a must. Joe signs into Zoom and Max welcomes Joe and the others who joined. Max reminds virtual attendees about his role, and he posts the link to the Google Drive in the chat box along with Anna's cell phone number in case anyone needs them. He reminds the virtual attendees to follow the ground rules and stay muted so everyone on Zoom can hear what is happening in the auditorium. Max also reminds them that he will ask questions on their behalf during the question and answer. Max then checks everyone can hear and see what is happening in the auditorium. Let's stop for a moment. How is Pine Ridge PTA doing so far? If you haven't started making notes, now is a good time to pause the recording and jot down some thoughts. The event starts with the first vice president introducing herself as the MC. Then she introduces Max as the virtual facilitator and explains his role and reminds the audience how to find the ground rules. She welcomes everyone and notes that 25 community members are participating in the event via Zoom. And then she introduces the town hall panelists. Both Kyle and Joe listen to the presentations and get ready for the Q&A. When it is time, Max prompts the virtual attendees to write their questions in the chat box, while the vice president asks the people in the auditorium to go to mics as per the ground rules. Joe writes a question as Kyle heads to a mic. The vice president recognizes Max to ask the first question on behalf of the virtual attendees, and then alternates between the virtual attendees and the in-person attendees as per the ground rules. Max asks Joe's question, and then Joe hears Kyle ask a question a few moments later. When the event is over, the vice president thanks everyone, both in the auditorium and on Zoom, for attending. She asks all attendees to fill out an evaluation form on the PTA's Google Drive. She tells the audience that Pine Ridge PTA loves feedback and listens to it. She says that feedback has helped Pine Ridge PTA build better hybrid events and meet the community's needs. Max thanks the virtual attendees and reminds the 3 Pine Ridge PTA board members on Zoom, including Joe, that the special board meeting will start in about 30 minutes. Kyle heads to the car. The event was interesting and educational. Joe gets up to stretch and compares this event to the one Evergreen PTA did a few weeks ago. You heard about that in part 1 of this training. Tonight's was a better experience despite the technical limitations. So what did you notice? How did Pine Ridge PTA's facilitation strategies help, and where did they fall short? What did Pine Ridge PTA do well? They planned. No PTA should go into a hybrid setting without planning. They evaluated their venue and identified the needs and challenges associated with the event and the venue. Then they developed strategies to ensure, as best they could, that everyone could see and be seen, hear and be heard, and participate. Pine Ridge PTA always assigns a virtual facilitator and tech support person for their events and meetings because they know it is good practice. The virtual facilitator ensures the virtual attendees are engaged and participate, and the tech support person helps out if someone runs into trouble. For tonight's town hall, they expanded their virtual facilitator's role to be sure that virtual attendees had a presence and could participate. Then they set expectations, made sure everyone knew the role of the virtual facilitator, and then created ground rules for this event that allowed everyone to participate. Ground rules are a great way to ensure there are no surprises and that everyone is included. Pine Ridge PTA also listened to their members' input to plan this event. What do you think? Did they set appropriate expectations and ensure as much as possible that both the in-person and virtual attendees had an equitable experience? What would your PTA have done differently? As part of their ground rules, Pine Ridge PTA did something really important, something your PTA will need to think about and plan for. Pine Ridge PTA used their ground rules to tell attendees what they needed to do to be recognized and to speak and ask questions. And their process did not favor the virtual or in-person attendee. Your PTA will need to do the same. Do you want people to raise a virtual or physical hand to be recognized? Or will your PTA go in alphabetical order or use another strategy? The size of your group will play a role in your decision making. More ideas about this can be found in the handout. However, no matter what your PTA decides, make sure it goes in the ground rules so that everyone who attends knows how to participate. Pine Ridge PTA did a few other things to ensure all attendees knew they were attending the same event. All documents, including ground rules and the evaluation, were in the cloud, so everyone had equal access. If this was a meeting and voting happened, or if they needed to brainstorm, they could also have used cloud-based solutions and included that information in the ground rules. Remember, the virtual and in-person attendees are both present at the same event. Pine Ridge PTA took deliberate action to ensure the in-person audience knew the virtual audience was there. They acknowledged the virtual audience in their ground rules. They introduced Max and explained his role as surrogate. And the MC noted the 25 people who joined the town hall via Zoom. What would your PTA do in this situation? Your PTA will need to plan to be deliberately inclusive at its hybrid events and meetings. It is easy to forget virtual attendees if you are attending or facilitating a face-to-face event or meeting, and it's easy to forget the in-person attendees if the facilitator joined the event or meeting virtually. Ideas for how to ensure everyone knows everyone else is there are in the handout. I promised you 2 scenarios, so here comes number 2. This time you will hear about Pine Ridge PTA's special board meeting that occurred 30 minutes after the town hall. Make note of the planning that went into the meeting. How the strategies used are similar and different from the ones used during the town hall. Listen for how Pine Ridge PTA ensured everyone, including the committee chair calling in from her car, participated equally. And watch for how Pine Ridge PTA uses something called asynchronous brainstorming as a tool to keep their meetings short. Asynchronous means not happening at the same time, and you can learn more about that from the handout. Joe and 2 other board members sign onto Zoom from their computers. Sharon calls in from her car. Max greets them all and does a sound and video check. Max's laptop is being used at a table in a small room. The board is around the table looking at the laptop screen, and everyone can see and hear each other. The president has placed nameplates for each of the virtual attendees in front of an empty chair, so each person has a physical presence in the room and at the table. Joe smiles and knows that no one in the room will forget that the virtual attendees are present. The president calls the meeting to order at 8 p.m. and Max calls the roll. The president reminds board members about the ground rules and that the agenda and support materials have been on the Google Drive for more than a week. He thanks Sharon and the fundraising committee for using the PTA's Google Drive to ensure that all board members can read the support materials and offer ideas and concerns on a spreadsheet on the drive. Sharon makes a motion on behalf of the committee to select Make It Fun Fundraisers as the vendor for the spring fundraiser. When she speaks to the motion, Sharon thanks the board for sharing their ideas and asking questions on the spreadsheet on the Google Drive. She says the board's use of the asynchronous brainstorming tool allowed the committee to see trends and to make a recommendation that addressed the board's concerns about capacity. They recommended Make It Fun fundraising because that vendor's proposal nets the most earnings for the least amount of volunteer effort. As the ground rules provide, the president gives each board member, in alphabetical order, 2 minutes to speak to the motion. Most comment positively and a few pass. Then the president notes the ground rules allow them to vote by voice or by using a cloud-based platform, the link of which was in the agenda. He says, if there are no objections, we will vote by voice. When no one objects, he calls the vote and the Pine Ridge PTA's board approves the motion. The meeting is adjourned at 8:16 p.m. Okay, let's look at our notes. What did you notice? Pine Ridge PTA made sure everyone had access to cloud-based materials and came prepared. Ground rules guided attendance and debate and voting. There were no surprises. Everyone had the same expectations. Max again acted as a virtual facilitator, but in a much simpler role for this meeting. Asynchronous brainstorming did not replace debate, but it did help the committee and shorten the meeting. And short, focused hybrid meetings are the way to go for all PTAs. Voting was simple, and Pine Ridge PTA had a cloud-based solution ready to go if they needed it. Did you notice anything else? Your PTA can master and do what Pine Ridge PTA did, run an effective, successful hybrid meeting and event. You have the tools to do it, for the technology and for the facilitation, in both Part 1 and Part 2 of this training and in the handout. Thanks for getting this far in the recordings. Remember, hybrid is here to stay. It serves the needs of your members and your community. It opens PTA to a broader audience. It ensures inclusion and equity. Your PTA can provide value to anyone, anywhere. Think about how that will help your PTA grow, identify new leaders, and support children and families. Why not give it a try?